Good day, everybody, and welcome to another edition of the Military and Foreign Affairs Network. I am your host, the voice of reason. Today, we are continuing our ongoing coverage of the Russian-Ukrainian war. So today, we are continuing to look at the headlines, and most of mainstream media headlines indicate that there is now the possibility that we could see a second front opening up within the vicinity of Belarus. We could see a renewed operation by Russian forces coming from either the Hamel region south, Bryansk Oblast south into Chernihiv in the direction towards Kiev. Now, some would indicate that hostilities in terms of this renewed Russian offensive could take place as early as January or February. Highly unlikely. Now, I do believe at this point, and we are receiving information that indicates as such, that the Russians are preparing the groundwork for a possible renewed push from either Belarus or the Russian state border near Belarus. We are seeing the building of roads, the clearing of forested areas, the setting up of transportation and logistical nodes that would be required for a new Russian offensive south from Belarus or areas near Belarus in the direction of Kiev. We're also seeing the deployment of both Russian and Belarusian forces near the Polish border as well. So we're seeing additional Russian forces near Brest and areas north of Brest. The Russian force construct inside of Belarus is now estimated to be between 10 and 20,000 Russian forces. Now, obviously, the Russians are in all probability going to need to deploy additional forces into Belarus before they launch said operation south towards Kiev. Again, the forces that the Russians have compiled in Belarus currently do not match the forces that had been moved into Belarus when the initial invasion took place, when we saw that failed Russian drive towards Kiev. Now, some would say that the Belarusian army, the Belarusian ground forces, could be assisting Russian forces and add additional forces to the whole that could then increase the battle groups that the joint Russian and Belarusian forces could move into Ukraine. And I think at this point that is fairly unlikely, meaning we would see large amounts of Belarusian forces being deployed into Ukraine. I think the current political situation inside of Belarus simply does not allow for that kind of deployment to take place. Now, what we are seeing, especially in terms of what the Russians are doing on the ground in southern Belarus in terms of preparations, again, the logistics being set up, those signs do point to some sort of operation that could take place in the distant future. Probably not January, because look, January is just a couple of weeks away. Then we go into March, April, And these areas that run along the Ukrainian Belarusian army become incredibly marshy. I believe even more so than what we see in the southeast, where some of the heaviest fighting is taking place now. So again, I go back to my original time frame of that summer, late summer possibility for a renewed Russian drive either towards Kiev or more likely east of the Dnieper River south, designed to separate Ukrainian forces in the east and possibly look for a breakthrough that would look to destroy the Ukrainian army that has massed and is defending eastern Ukraine, the Donbass. And again, those two drives would center south from Chernihiv along the Dnieper River south on the eastern bank of the Dnieper River, and then north, south to north from Zaporizhia, again on the eastern bank of the Dnieper River. That seems the most logical course that the Russians would take. Now, look, it is possible we could see an attempt by the Russian military to make a dash towards Kiev again. We could see it. I know that when the initial hostilities started, I personally, as I analyzed the situation, did not believe that the Russians would look to seize control of Kiev. I had assumed that, quite possibly, that the Russian buildup in Belarus, just north of Chernobyl, was giving the Kremlin options. It served as a diversionary purpose as long as they did not execute operations into Ukraine. But it also gave the Kremlin, if things were going incredibly well in the east, it would then give the Russians the option of then launching an operation towards Kiev. But again, early going in the war, as I analyzed the prospects of war, I did not believe that the Russians would attempt the full-on operation that we saw. And it was probably, well, it wasn't probably, it was. They bit off more than they could chew, the Russians, without fully mobilizing and deploying much more forces in all probability that they needed. So the likelihood that we would see a Russian move towards Kiev, I think at this point, is remote. Now, again, on the eastern bank of the Dnieper River, I think we could see a highly likely Russian military campaign in the north, coming out of Bryansk, coming out of other areas just east of the Dnieper River, south of Hamel, on Belarusian territory. I think that is very possible at this point. But again, a move towards Kiev outside of a blocking force that the Russians would set up on the eastern bank of the Dnieper River and then allow the Russians to shell targets in Kiev proper, again, that seems more probable than this all-out attempt to seize Kiev. So the Russians are absolutely doing something right now. We just don't know what. There are a lot of Russian forces in training and in the preparation phase for some sort of operation. But again, in all likelihood, that operation comes summer, late summer. but we'll see. Anyway, we're going to continue to monitor and report what is happening on the ground. And just one more quick element to our observations. We have seen the president of Ukraine, Zelensky, take a trip to Bakhmut. Now, that's very interesting that trip occurred, because that trip says something. That trip by Zelensky to Bakhmut tells us that the Ukrainians are comfortable moving Zelensky, in all probability, well, not in all probability, absolutely by road convoy on the ground from Kiev to Bakhmut. Obviously, they believe that their intelligence is good enough to safely move him to Bakhmut, where some of the heaviest fighting is currently taking place. That should concern Russian observers. Again, I've talked about before the lack of apparent Russian interdiction capability. Compounding that, there may be Russian intel deficits as well, deficiencies as well. So again, for Ukraine to allow Zelensky to move from Kiev hundreds of miles east towards the conflict zone in Bakhmut, pretty bold. But again, it also says something about the Ukrainian comfort zone in terms of what they believe Russian capability is. But again, we'll continue to analyze that, and then obviously we could be proved wrong in the near future in terms of that movement. But that's the way I see it right now. So we'll have more again very, very soon. Thank you for joining us today. More to come. Have a good day.